I began to see that there needed to be new work on the Athenian Empire done as part of this broader disciplinary assessment about what it means to be a historian and a classicist today.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. We've all heard and been taught, or even repeated and taught our own students, the standard narrative of the Athenian Empire. The Athenians inherited command of the Hellenic alliance at the end of the Persian Wars. That alliance then transformed into the Delian League with Athens as hegemon, but over time, Athenian power evolved from hegemony to empire. That's the narrative that Thucydides gives us, and it's how he frames his account of the Constantakopoulou, the roughly 50-year period between the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. In Book 1 of his history, section 96, he recounts how, because of the Greeks' general hatred of the Spartan commander Pausanias, the Athenians succeeded to hegemonia, within the Hellenic alliance at the end of the Persian Wars. And here I'll read a little bit of his Book 1, sections 96 to 7, in the translation from the landmark edition of the history. So Thucydides writes, "The Athenians determined which cities were to contribute money against the barbarian and which ships, their professed object being to retaliate for their sufferings by ravaging the king's country. Now was the time that the office of treasurers for Hellas, so that's the Hellenotamiai, was first instituted by the Athenians. These officers received the tribute, the phoros, as the money contributed was called. The tribute was first fixed at 460 talents. The common treasury was at Delos, and the congresses were held in the temple." And Thucydides continues, "Initially, the Athenians commanded autonomous allies and made their decisions in general congresses. Their supremacy, and that's hegemonia, their supremacy grew during the interval between the present war and the Persian Wars." And again, the standard narrative goes that, over the course of the Constantakopoulou, this hegemony evolved into the empire, the ἀρχή. And it was then Spartan fear and anxiety around this growth of Athenian power that was the so-called truest cause of the Peloponnesian War, as Thucydides had already told us back in section 23. So Thucydides' line on the Athenian Empire is the standard one. And historically, the practice had been to try to make our other evidence for it fit into his narrative. But there are problems with that kind of methodology. Despite his own claims to rationalism and objectivity, Thucydides, of course, had his own perspective on things, and he had certain agendas to push and axes to grind. Another issue is that the vocabulary of the Athenian Empire is itself tricky. Just how should we be translating ἀρχή? And to what extent was there really a distinction between the ἀρχή and the hegemony? There's also the question of what to call and how even to understand the allies, the symmachoi, or sometimes just the polis, the cities, or even the islanders. To what extent were these communities allies, and to what extent were they subject states? And how much say did they actually have in all of this, from the nature of their relationship to Athens to the amount and kind of tribute that they contributed to the Athenian imperial coffers? Both of my guests for this episode have published on the complexity of those questions, and have made attempts to detect traces of the allies' own agency in this story. Their work, in turn, has served to complicate the familiar narrative of the Athenian Empire's nature and evolution. So it's a pleasure to welcome into the Lesche my two guests for this episode. They're Leah Lazar and Christy Constantakopoulou. Leah Lazar is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for the Study of Ancient Documents in Oxford. She's part of the ERC-funded CHANGE Project, researching the monetary and economic history of Anatolia from the 7th to the 1st centuries BC. In January of 2025, she'll be starting as a lecturer at the University of Manchester. And her first book, Athens and Power in the 5th Century BC, came out this year with Oxford University Press, and that book is really the impetus for this episode. My other guest, Christy Constantakopoulou, is a researcher at the National Hellenic Research Foundation. She was previously Professor of Classics and Ancient History at Birkbeck College of the University of London. She has published on the history of the Aegean Islands, ancient historiography, Greek religion, and the Athenian Empire. Her book, The Dance of the Islands, Insularity, Networks, the Athenian Empire, and the Aegean World, came out in 2007 with Oxford University Press, with a paperback in 2010. Just a quick note that I'll be putting some references and resources in the show notes for the episode. Welcome into the Lesche, Leah Lazar and Christy Constantakopoulou. The first voice you'll be hearing next is Leah's.
Well, I have to say that I was initially drawn to the topic of the Athenian Empire, I think through a slight lack of imagination and naivety, just because I, as many students, studied the Athenian Empire as part of my undergraduate degree. And I remember the tutorial that I did on the topic in my final year, and I really was just dissatisfied with the scholarship that was available. I really felt that there wasn't a good synthetic overview of the Athenian Empire as a whole, and a lot of the really difficult sources simply, there weren't good explanations on this really difficult evidence. But when I started digging, I realised that a new approach to the Athenian Empire was really necessary and really timely. A lot of past scholarship on the empire, not just from the 19th and 20th centuries, but even some quite recent scholarship, has really been conditioned by European colonial perspectives. And I was, as a doctoral student, when I was first starting this research, trying to keep abreast of broader developments in the field of ancient history and the way that other scholars were thinking about ancient Greek history and classics. And I began to see that there needed to be new work on the Athenian Empire done as part of this broader disciplinary assessment about what it means to be a historian and a classicist today.
Well, let's start, you said so much there, but let's start with your dissatisfaction around the scholarship. And that's actually the foot you lead on or in your introduction. And I think it was very compelling what you say. And you start by talking about the lapis primus and the Athenian tribute lists and the story of scholarship around that, and sort of why that scholarship and the end products of it might be intimidating to people who wanted to look at this material with a fresh perspective. Could you maybe speak a little bit about, what you say in the introduction regarding the kind of imposing status of these, both physical monuments and monuments of classical scholarship?
So what I tried to conjure up in the introduction was a picture of how both tantalizing but also fragmentary, particularly the epigraphic sources on the Athenian Empire are, and how they're incredibly important survivals, but ones that we can't fully know or understand. But that past scholarship on the Athenian Empire has tried to draw them into a complete and seamless picture of how the empire worked. So I guess already as an undergraduate, I perhaps sensed that there was too much of a complete picture, and one very much focused on Athens as a centre of imperial power rather than on its subjects.
So with this standard narrative, right, that the Athenian, and which we get from Thucydides and maybe can infer from other sources, right, that the Athenian, what we think of as the empire started out at this hegemony, and then at some point it became more controlling, more domineering. We have, everybody knows 454. Okay, the treasury moves to Athens, and Athens is the narrative is that it just starts sort of exerting a tighter and tighter grip on the allies and becoming kind of nastier as this domineering force. So where did you see then an opportunity to enter in and refocus that narrative?
Well, for a start, I think it was really important to change the way that we were thinking about Athenian interaction with subject communities, and to bring them to centre stage as agents in the process of empire, but simultaneously not to minimise Athenian exploitation and violence. So I guess, really to shift the focus from mostly Athens as imperial centre to a more dynamic dialogue within the empire.
Well, one of the pieces of scholarship that you name in the introduction as having been really important for, opening up these new directions was Christy's book on the Dance of the Islands. Christy, do you want to just say a little bit about your book and how you came to that material and where you see your arguments about networks and insularity in this kind of broader trajectory of scholarship on the empire?
Yeah, I mean, I had a different trajectory than Leah in how I came to study insularity and the Athenian Empire. In the sense that, first of all, my work is like 20 years before Leah, so, I'm the kind of older generation. So I was really interested in looking at the geographic perspective and the impact of geography and locality onto ancient history. And because I was interested in the 5th century as a classically trained historian, we grow up with the sources, with the Thucydides and the tragedies and the inscriptions, and they're all 5th century. So obviously that was for me the period I was going to look at. But I wanted to look at that period, what impact the environment has, and specifically insularity. And since the 5th century is a period dominated by the existence of the empire, which does mark a shift in how the Greeks view the world, how the Greeks interact with non-Greeks, how violence and power and agency, all the things that Leah talked about, actually operate within the Aegean, I had to look at the Athenian Empire. So I started from the geography perspective, but inevitably ended up looking at how the geography perspective, so insularity, what it is to be an islander, what it means to live on an island, what insularity means within an imperial context. So I didn't really use the word agent back then, but I think I was interested in insular agency, even though I didn't phrase it in those terms. That came for me a bit later in my thinking. And as part of the, what does it mean to be an islander? How do these people live? Well, networks and connectivity became a very essential part of the narrative I was putting forward, in the sense that if I wanted to kind of highlight the life of the islander within the 5th century context, I wanted to talk about how these islands were not isolated worlds, but they were part of active networks of communication, of religious interaction, of diplomatic exchange, of ideas exchange, but also networks of violence and exploitation. And that's where the empire comes in. And what I saw particularly in some of the smaller islands is how the Athenian Empire became a powerful agent for economic change. In other words, it forced smaller communities and islands to enter, sometimes for the first time, networks of monetary exchange. These people had to find silver or coin silver in most cases to pay the tribute. That meant that perhaps it was the first time that they actually entered this kind of economic networks of exchange, and it was through a context of exploitation. So I said a lot of things. I'm not sure where I'm going to, but I started with geography and the impact on history, and then ended up looking at some forms of imperial history and the importance of islands in that imperial history.
Well, I think that, Christy, with your work, speaking from personal experience, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, but when I ask students in my classical Greek history class what bibliography sort of most excited them over the course of the semester, many of them will always say that it was your work. So I think that there was this, or there still is this, a real interest to see things not just from this ethnocentric perspective, of course. It seems a bit banal to say at this point, but to really get in, to the texture of these networks, of what this connectivity looked like. Leah, to come back to your really important word, rubric of agency, to recover some of that. And Leah, I thought that, maybe you could speak a little bit about the places that you really see the agency of the Athenian allies in the 5th century. I just want to read very briefly just a sentence or two from your introduction, which really drew me in, where you write that allowing for negotiation, so the negotiation between the allies and the Athenians, as opposed to seeing it as a one-way street. So allowing for negotiation is not apologist. It does not preclude the possibility of Athenian violence or rapacity. In fact, it allows for a better understanding of how exploitation operated. Further, it emphatically acknowledges allied communities and individuals as active agents and brings their experiences to center stage. So could you maybe speak a little bit about your sources for this agency? You did a lot of, I think, very compelling actual imaginative work around just the experiences of people engaged in this negotiation. So yeah, just tell us a little bit about where we find these hints, these whiffs of allied agency in the sources.
Well, for a start, I guess the concept of negotiation I thought about in the first instance from a comparative perspective, in that empires, imperial powers, often throughout history have allowed for negotiation processes in order to assert their authority in a more resource-light way, to allow for easier imperial administration, and to bring their subjects, often elite individuals, into the imperial project, and to direct their energies towards discussion, dialogue, rather than dissent. So this was my point of departure. We see these kinds of processes in other ancient empires, and I wondered whether traces could also be found in the 5th century Athenian Empire. And as I discussed in my introduction, there are definitely hints in Thucydides, but he's not particularly focused on the interaction between Athens and, the little guys in the empire, the many small communities who made up the bulk of the empire, who were contributing small amounts of money and tribute. So I turned first to the Athenian epigraphic records, to Athenian inscriptions, and I argue in the book that the Athenian decrees which record interactions between Athens and allied communities preserve some of the traces of a negotiation process. You have to dig in these documents to see them, because they're products of Athenian democratic self-representation, but they are also records of diplomatic processes. And I think we can also see these negotiation processes allowing for allied agency elsewhere. I argue that we see the kind of bilateral interactions in the tribute quota lists. And in the course of my research, I also thought it was increasingly important to look beyond these Athenian sources and to turn to sources from allied communities which might more indirectly reflect their relationship with the empire.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking, and you cite it back to that, there's the book chapter by Robin Osborne called Inscribing Performance, I think, that was really, helped a lot to sort of wake people up to the ways that these decrees, these inscriptions that might seem sort of very dry and devoid of, detail and color, in a way that they do preserve these traces of conversations, of arguments, of the people coming and going, and that's something that you really open up. Do you mind? Is there an example of one that you could speak a little bit about, where a particular decree or inscription that bears the traces of more mobility, more agency on the part of allies, more back and forth negotiation than we might recognize at first glance?
Sure. So one of my favourite inscriptions that I considered first actually in my master's dissertation before looking at it for the book is the document recording a series of Athenian decrees about the community of Methone in the North Aegean near Macedon. And the original inscription, which is now in the Acropolis Museum in Athens because it's got a beautiful document relief at the top, the original inscription would have preserved 4 decrees concerning Athenian relations with Methone, but we only have the first 2 now surviving on the stone. And it's a very remarkable series of documents showing the Athenians awarding considerable privileges to this small community far away from Athens, most notably including exemption from monetary tribute. And in the decree, we also get hints about the backdrop to why Athens would want to award these privileges to Methone. And that's because Perdiccas, the king of Macedon, is causing Methone significant trouble. And the Athenians clearly really want to keep Methone, which is strategically located, an important harbour really close to Macedon. They want to keep this community in the empire. And that even some moments in the phrasing of the decree where we hear the words of the Methonian ambassadors. So I think you can, by reading the decrees closely, pick up on this back and forth between Athens and Methone and the arguments that the ambassadors from this community might have made in order to ensure that they got these privileges.
One of the moments in Thucydides, despite the sort of problematic and complicating nature of his arch narrative, is that you, I think, take some starting points from is his description, his framing of the Mytilenean debate, right? In the way that we can imagine the Mytileneans there in Athens as advocates, maybe sort of having these meetings in smoke-filled rooms with Diodorus, asking for this, support and help. And I thought that was a really interesting way that what comes out of the actual inscribed record can help us to open up moments in Thucydides even more in a way as a sort of back and forth. Christy, in your own work, because you mentioned that this departure point in a way of Thucydides, I mean, how did you see the inscribed record as telling a different story than what we would get in the literary sources?
Well, I think inscriptions are fascinating exactly because they provide a completely different point of view from our literary sources. And this is particularly significant for our field because our field of classics developed through a close study of the literary sources of Thucydides and Herodotus, which we traditionally put at a much higher pedestal of credibility than any other source. So looking at the inscription immediately makes it more refreshing. And additionally, it provides a different point of view, which in the case of the Athenian decrees, it's the point of view of the collective demos of the Athenians. Thucydides speaks only for himself. Here we see something that the Athenian people voted and decided as a whole. So that immediately creates a different perspective, takes us away from Thucydides' own agenda and that word bias that we see in students' essays, and it's a very difficult word, but it's kind of necessary when you talk about literary sources. So this is important for inscriptions. Recently, I came across the work of anthropologist Vina Das, and she talks about the concept of poisonous knowledge. She says that traumatic, violent histories are transmitted. She's a modern, she's an anthropologist talking about modern trauma, like the trauma of war in the last kind of 30, 40 years within living memory. So traumatic histories and violent histories are transmitted through the present through series of gaps and silences and what she calls poisonous knowledge. Now, when I came across that, I was immediately struck by how relevant such a reading would be, particularly for inscriptions. Because inscriptions encapsulate a moment in time, the decision of the Athenian assembly at one particular time that talks about, as Leah says, the Methone kind of long process of negotiation, or the Chalkis decree, another fantastic decree, which is the decree that regulates the relationship between Chalkis and Athens after Chalkis tried to rebel, and its rebellion was crushed by the Athenians. And there in the Chalkis decree, but also in the Methone decree, which has a less violent past, I should say, but in the Chalkis decree that has a violent past, I could see this kind of poisonous knowledge through the gaps. So the gaps, there are gaps in the narrative. There are the hostages mentioned that are kept. These are the sons of prestigious people of Chalkis that are kept as hostages in Athens for many, many years. And this is a very, very violent issue for the Chalkis community. And that is only mentioned by and by. We don't get the whole narrative of what happened in the rebellion. We just get bits and glimpses of knowledge. And I think thinking about this knowledge as poisonous knowledge because it talks about a very violent and dramatic past might help us understand why, one of the reasons why inscriptions are never provide a complete narrative, but only talk to an audience that already they assume we know the narrative. And of course we don't. And we're trying, I think Leah mentioned right at the start how incomplete our knowledge is. We try from little pieces here and there, little glimpses of language to create a narrative about the past. And this is what past scholarship did. They created a full narrative with full explanations based on Thucydides without acknowledging openly how much their narrative is really Thucydides' narrative. And I think it's very important the work that Leah is doing, which is try to unpack this narrative and actually highlight the gaps. And I don't know, I just love the idea of poisonous knowledge through as a way to experience trauma and violence and to articulate about that. And I think that would be really useful. I'm planning to think about this more carefully and try to apply it more consistently in the work I'm doing on inscriptions.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds fascinating. And I think that, in Leah's study, one of the aspects of it that I felt most drawn to was that you do this historical work, but you're also doing historiographical work and sort of looking at how this knowledge was constructed in the first place, and specifically from that starting point of the tribute lists and the way that the Thucydidean narrative was, projected onto the tribute lists and the initial narrative that we got around them, and then, so many people are taught. And Leah, one of the things that you do in the book is trouble longstanding assumptions about how the so-called tribute foros worked. And you even suggest that, maybe that's not even a great translation, or at least it comes with certain baggage. So could you speak a little bit about the ways that you opened up new perspectives on how the foros worked and how the allies actually were engaged in some moments, in some places, at least in conversations and negotiations with Athens about what the foros that they contributed looked like and the amount?
For sure. So I argue, especially in the second chapter of the book, that the Athenian tribute system was actually a really complex fiscal system that relied on a lot of complex processes within allied communities. And that was building on work by lots of scholars, including Christy, and in particular, Nixon and Price's 1990 paper on using the tribute lists as economic documents. And I argue that if we read the tribute lists carefully, we can see many bilateral processes between the Athenians and individual allies, whereby their levels of tribute are assessed and negotiated based on the individual circumstances of those communities, including their internal fiscal structures, their local processes of taxation and revenue production. And I also argue that these negotiation processes became more regimented as the empire drew on, and the Athenians were under increasing pressure from the Peloponnesian War and needed to raise more money.
Yeah, I think that one of the assumptions that it's tempting to make is just that, how is tribute assessed? You're a relatively rich polity, so it'll be this. You're a smaller one with not much, so it'll be this. And you show how, sort of how much was taken into account and the extent to which these conversations took place with reference to all these local structures, as you were saying. Could you say a little bit about why maybe tribute isn't, or is sort of a problematic translation for foros?
It might imply a rather simplistic or irregular extraction of revenue, perhaps through force, by not a complex, systematized fiscal exploitation like I think we see with the Athenian Empire. So I think in the book I talk about how it's often applied to nomadic empires that sort of just come in and plunder and exert pressure on communities in a less systematic way.
Yeah, I think in the last 15 years it's got this like real Hunger Games resonance too. I mean, it's...
Exactly.
One of the things that you're both interested in is the importance of the festal context as these sites of interaction and negotiation. So Leah, maybe, could you just speak a little bit about your chapter and your work on these festivals, particularly the city Dionysia and the big Panathenea, as sites for the themes that you're interested in, where you imagine the presence of representatives from the Allies and their sensory experiences of being in Athens and what that might have looked like as a site of negotiation on the ground?
So in the first part of the book, and also my earliest research on the empire, I was thinking about political and economic negotiations between the Athenians and subject communities. But I increasingly realised that that couldn't be separated from the cultural relationship between Athens and its subjects, and also the experiences of the individuals doing the negotiating. And one of the key contexts when all sorts of dialogues and negotiations took place was Athenian festivals, when individuals, usually influential individuals from allied communities, came to Athens and participated in religious rituals, observed athletic competitions, the performance of plays, and also engaged in both formal and informal interactions with Athenians and Athenian individuals. So I really wanted to understand how potentially the different experiences that these allied individuals would have in these contexts would then inform how they negotiated on behalf of their communities, and also how they took Athenian cultural production home. So I argue in the book that the influence of Athenian culture on subject communities that we begin to see on the ground in their cultural production is perhaps indirect evidence of this process of these individuals coming to Athens, negotiating with the Athenians, absorbing Athenian culture, and then going home.
Yeah, I think that the most obvious place to think about all of this is, of course, the Panathenea. It's sort of, built into the word. But, you bring out these elements of the city Dionysia that I've also always really been interested in. It's just so fundamental, I think, this notion that it was coordinated, that's when the tribute effectively is delivered. And then after the festival, there's an announcement about who's paid up, who owes. You get all these sort of, little anecdotes, who knows how reliable that, but they're fun to think with and about, like that. Sophocles was a Hellenotimias at one point. It is somehow involved in this process. And you come back quite a few times to the story of Aristophanes and the Babylonians and sort of getting in trouble with Cleon about how he represents the city, the festival of the Dionysia, which then, of course, Dicaeopolis talks about in the Acharnians, saying, okay, well, this is a different occasion. This is the Linnea. Now I can speak freely. It's not the Dionysia where everybody is here. Could you say just a little bit about the experience of the Dionysia and the intersection between this theatrical festival, which is, usually taught as just, a site for the productions of the plays? How was that embedded in the fabric, really, of the imperial administration?
Yes, as you say, I found this overlap between different aspects of Athenian power in the context of the Dionysia completely fascinating. The fact that delegations from allied communities had to bring their tribute to Athens at that time, and even, according to later sources, parade it around the theatre before dramatic performances. And then also potentially sit in the audience to witness these incredibly important parts of Athenian cultural production. So there's a really important overlap there between the fiscal system, between economic negotiations, and between allied consumption of Athenian culture. And in the book, I discuss a really interesting inscription that provides evidence for imitation of the Athenian Dionysia on the island of Rhodes a few decades after the end of the Athenian Empire. And it's really hard to construct a direct relationship between this imitation of the Dionysia and the original. But it seems to me that there has to be something there in terms of the Rhodians being forced to come to Athens to witness their festival and then taking something home.
Yeah, the kind of forced fun of the Dionysia. Well, Christy, you also write about aspects of, I think, what today we might just call the soft power of the Athenian Empire in your work. Could you speak a little bit to that, sort of these places where we see, even beyond the economic structures, the Athenians sort of exerting this cultural influence through these sort of softer means?
Yeah, I think I'll start again with the issue of the sources, that we have very few lines and we build kind of huge narratives on them. But I think the sources that talk about the Dionysia and the Panathenaea, but I'll start with the Dionysia as a key point of what, Leah called the allied consumption of Athenian culture. I think that's a very, very good way of putting it. Is crucial. So, the parade of the tribute in sacks after sacks after sacks of silver being paraded in the theater. And, of course, the orphans that are also part of this parade, the orphans of fathers who died at war. So this, for me, it's kind of the two, for the Athenian mentality, the two crucial aspects of embodied imperial administration. It's the bodies of the men, of the orphans, and the absent bodies of the fathers, so presence and absence of embodied empire, and of course the materiality of tribute also as a body of power being paraded onto the theater. So this kind of materiality of imperial administration and presence and absence of bodies as part of imperial power, I think are crucial in understanding how the Dionysia work as a way of articulating Athenian concepts of empire. And this, of course, is consumed and taken back. Now, we don't have many of the allied sources. So I think Leah's reconstruction of what happens at Rhodes is absolutely brilliant because, it shows, I'm totally with you, Leah, on this, I was totally convinced, that they do take the Dionysia and play with it. And the allies also take epigraphic culture and honorific habits. So it's not just the Athenians that honor, the allies also honor. And you see this bilateral exchange of honors and appreciation within a context of imperial power, and using a language that is democratic Athenian when the allies don't perhaps don't have democratic procedures themselves. There's certainly almost none of them had the kind of radical democracy, as far as we can understand, that Athens had when it was producing this kind of imperial documents in the second half of the 5th century. So they take that language, they take after revolts, they take the democratic constitution as well, imposed by them, by the Athenians. They take the religious experience, and I think the materiality of the religious experience of going to the festivals, going and seeing the Parthenon being built, and the biggest temple, the biggest temple in mainland Greece, and so on. But of course, we don't have the sources that would talk about the kinds of soft power that we would like to know. The individual experience, the relationship with the divine, all these kind of things that Athens is taking and reshaping, we don't really have from the Allied point of view. But what we see in the 4th century, which is a huge kind of boom of epigraphic language all over the Greek world, but particularly in the areas of the empire, of the previous, Athenian empire, is a testament of soft power and impact.
So just in the proliferation of this, so-called epigraphic habit even.
Not just epigraphic habit. So one is the actual epigraphic habit, which is a start inscribing things on stone, public decisions on stone, which a lot of them, with the exception of Crete and Chios, didn't really do in the past to such an extent. So first they do that, and that must be related with Athenian democratic procedures and the Athenian kind of democratic and imperial administration that needs to produce things on stone. So they do that, they take that and run with it, and after the 5th century, the 4th and 3rd and 2nd centuries, all over the Aegean and then the Eastern Mediterranean, we have hundreds of thousands of inscriptions being produced. But the other is they actually also use the Athenian democratic language, which a lot of them didn't have by themselves, as far as we can judge.
Maybe we could talk a little bit more about this case at Rhodes, Leah, because this is one, the second half of your book goes into these regional case studies, right? So you have a chapter on the North Aegean, and then one on Rhodes in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then one on the sort of pro-Pontic areas, the areas around the straits, the Bosporus and the Hellespont, and those communities. I mean, could you speak a little bit more about sort of what you do with Rhodes? Because I think that for me, one of the, there is this wonderful work that you do at kind of recovering the back and forth, but you also make this point about how even long after the Athenian Empire was over, it still there's like this kind of long tail of it still embedded in the cultural, civic, political practices of Rhodes. Could you just speak a little bit more about that case study?
Sure. So I use Rhodes as a way into thinking about Athenian relationships with the Eastern Mediterranean in the first instance. And I argue that we can see some Athenian attempts to move towards southern Anatolia, Cyprus, Egypt, the Levant early in the 5th century, but actually they failed to establish direct power there. And one of the ways that they then profit from this really important economic region beyond their direct control is by using allied communities like Rhodes, which had very long experience of interacting with this region and exploiting it. They use these communities through the tribute system to essentially just skim off the top of Rhodian exploitation, trade, power there. So I use Rhodes as a way into thinking about how the Athenians indirectly access the riches of the Eastern Mediterranean. And then I turn more to Rhodes and its immediate environs in the southeastern Aegean and think about how Athenian power competed with Rhodes's regional status as a power on the smaller islands nearby and also the Anatolian mainland. And I argue for a process of Athenian competition with Rhodes, where sometimes the Athenians are happy for the Rhodians to be doing their own thing because they can profit from Rhodian power and influence, but sometimes Rhodian power comes into conflict with the Athenian Empire.
Well, Christy, the case of Rhodes was also really important for your work. I mean, could you speak a little bit then to the kind of insular network around Rhodes and those interactions? So Rhodes in its immediate geographical environment, as opposed to with reference to Athens.
So Rhodes becomes one of the most powerful states in the Mediterranean later on in the third century, and the reason it does that is that it has an extremely good port sitting right at the roots connecting the north, from the northern Aegean to the Black Sea, to the south to Crete and Cyprus, but also later on to the Syro-Palestinian coast and Egypt. So it's sitting right there at the important trade routes. It has a very good port, so it provides the necessities for trade to happen. And that allows it to become a very important power, especially after the three cities, the three poleis of Rhodes decide to synthesize, to become one city in, I'm going to say 408, Leah? Is that I've lost memory of kind of 408, isn't it? So at 408, end of 5th century anyway, they become one unified city. And that really gives a huge boost to Rhodian power. That's one thing. The fact, like Athens sits on one of the best ports geographically of the Eastern Mediterranean, Piraeus, and that is a key pillar in its success in becoming an empire. So Rhodes sits on one of the best ports, again, in that important route south-north. But Rhodes is not just a big and important island. It also controls a whole archipelago of other islands in different forms of relationships. And in addition to that, it also controls a huge chunk of the opposite coast of Asia Minor, of Turkey, called the Pariah. Now, it's quite complicated and we're quite unsure as to which points in time exactly Rhodes ends up controlling the islands of Simi, Tylos, Chalkis, Nisiros, Megisti, and so on, Carpathos, Kassos, and so on, and at which point exactly it controls those huge chunks of the Pariah, because our sources are much later than the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, but it's pretty certain that the 5th century it does control some islands, and those islands that it doesn't control, it has a very, very close economic relationship and I would say supremacy over them. And so the same with some bits of the Pariah opposite. So we're talking about a huge city-state for Greek standards, sitting on very important trade routes. So in that sense, you could almost see Rhodes as a power that could potentially challenge Athens in naval supremacy, as indeed it does. The naval supremacy of 3rd century Rhodes is unparalleled for the 3rd century, right? And that's why, the Diadochi, the Alexander successors pay so much attention to Rhodes and tries to seize it and fail and try again and so on. But what we occasionally forget as a historian, that it's not just Rhodes, it's also the other islands of the archipelago, and it's also the hugely rich and resourceful, full of resources piece of the Asia Minor coast, the Pariah. So that, the kind of mixed insularity of Rhodes, which is one island plus other islands, it comes as a package, and the coast makes it as a very important player within the Athenian Empire, and certainly a very important player after the Athenian Empire.
Getting at these case studies, Leah, in your work, one can feel in the background, in your acknowledgments, you talk a lot about the travels that you did in researching the book. I mean, could you speak a little bit to how actually visiting these places, and you seem to have traveled extensively in both Greece and Turkey, how that might have, unsettled or shaped the perspectives that you had on this material? I mean, how could you have written the same book without ever physically having visited so many of these sites?
I don't think I could have. I was really lucky to have a lot of funding from my university, both during my doctorate and later for travel to both Greece and then later Turkey. And I felt that it was really important in accessing the perspectives of allied communities to use diverse sources, and many of these sources were, physical objects. So I wanted to fully understand and acknowledge the materiality of these objects by looking at them in museums and by situating them in their physical contexts, in archaeological sites, and also in the broader landscapes around these sites, to understand how these places fitted together. And of course, also to speak to Greek and Turkish colleagues who are way more experienced and knowledgeable than I am about these places and these objects. So yeah, that was a really big part of the research process for me. especially in the second half of the book when I write these regional case studies. And that continues to be a component of my research. I've been traveling quite a bit also for my new book.
Yeah, well, I guess I wanted to wrap up by asking both of you what's next. So, Leah, how is that travel going to be informing your next project?
So, what is the next project? I'm writing a new book as part of my postdoctoral position that is still looking at the complex interaction between imperial power and smaller communities in the ancient world, but through the lens of money and the economy, and particularly in ancient Anatolia. So bringing numismatics more into the picture that I was trying to paint in my first book. And alongside that, I'm not done with the Athenian Empire. I'm currently editing a book based on a conference last year, along with two colleagues, about the Athenian Empire, and Christy was at the conference and will also be participating in the book, which is great.
And how about for you, Christy, besides that chapter?
Yeah, I need to finish the chapter and send it to you, to Leah. But the idea was to rethink how we write the narrative of the Athenian Empire. And in fact, this is one of the big things I'm working on, which is to write user-friendly history of the Athenian Empire. So a book to replace Meg's Athenian Empire. Meg's is now 52 years old, exactly the same age as I am, and it's unsurpassed in its knowledge and detail and all of that. But I found increasingly when teaching, it's completely impenetrable to students nowadays. It's not just the use of Greek, it's the assumption of knowing all Greek history at your fingertips in order to understand what he's talking about. So I really want to write a book that takes into account new developments in ancient history more generally, which is to move away from Athens, to look at the agency, to look at networks of power, to look at the bodily experience. I'm really interested in that, to look at the gendered experience to the extent that we can, and so on, and apply all those new developments onto a new narrative of the Athenian Empire that can be read by first-year students. So a textbook, but also kind of a statement. So that's one project. The other project is that I, with Hans Beck and Jeremy McInerney, are the editors for the Oxford History of the Classical Greek World. And in fact, a lot of my ideas about classical history are the result of this kind of long collaboration with these two co-editors and the discussions we're having about the project. And of course, the chapters that keep coming in about different subjects, and Joanna, I mean, your chapter on how do the ancients approach the contemporary events, so Thucydides and Xenophon and so on, was like a fantastic contribution to the overall project. So that kind of I think I've reached the age where I'm really interested in the very basics. How do we write history? And why we write history, how we write history, and why should we write history in the sense of, does it matter what we say about the ancient world for the modern world? I think it matters a lot, and not just for the modern Greek state of which I'm a part, but I think it matters globally, because of ideas of white supremacy and racism and imperialism being so embedded in our discipline and being also the cornerstones for the development of our discipline. So I think how we write history matters, and it's very important that we address these key themes: imperialism, the money, the economy, as Leah said, and so on, and we tackle our assumptions right head on, and we try to produce a new narrative that is fairer and better for the 21st century. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that it would be just wonderful to have a new overview that was accessible for the Athenian Empire, because you mentioned the problem of teaching, or the challenges of teaching this material. and that for the undergraduates in particular, you can't assign MIGs. So what do? You wind up just assigning Thucydides and creating the problem all over again in a way. And I think it's really interesting to, what you said about this moment and the importance of reconsidering this material at this moment. Leah, that's something that you reflect upon quite a bit in the introduction. I don't know if you wanted to say a word about that.
Well, I think it's particularly important because the Athenian Empire has occupied such a central part of the kind of canonical history of the Greek world, that not only do we learn as students and scholars of the Greek world, but also it's integral to how the public understands ancient Greek history. So I think Christy's explained how we're undergoing this disciplinary reassessment at the moment, thinking about the role that our discipline has played in constructing ideologies of imperialism and white supremacy and so on. So in this disciplinary reassessment, we really need to look at the Athenian Empire as a canonical part of how we've done Greek history in the past.
If you don't mind, we'll end with a little game. So this is just to lighten the mood, this is a word association game. So I'm going to say a word, and then I'll call on one of you to just say the first thing that comes to mind, and then we'll see what the other one has to say, and we'll kind of mix up the order so nobody gets special treatment. So the first word is, and Leah, let's start with you, is ἀρχή or ἀρχή.
Empire.
How about you, Christy? What comes to mind?
Power.
All right, so Christy, phoros.
You see, I'm just going to say tribute, but that's because I translate the Greek in my head, right? So it's more difficult to do the word association if it's a Greek term. So tribute, but in the sense of not economic tribute, of tribute as I pay tribute to this fantastic author, for example. So it's less economic, yeah.
How about you, Leah, for phoros?
Well, I think Christy took my word, but I'll go with taxation.
Okay, yeah, there you go. All right, Leah, Athenian tribute list.
I was going to say my favourite inscriptions, but I don't know that's more than one word.
That's fine, that's fine. How about for you, Christy?
You know what? A game. I think it's reconstructing the Lapis Primus was a game of jigsaw that they did, and we base so much of a narrative on their game. So game.
I like it. Meta answer for this. Yeah. Okay, how about Christy? So the Panathenea.
Yeah. Together.
Leah?
Spectacle.
And the last one for you here, Leah, is Thucydides.
Genius.
Christy?
Green. He's green in my head, and Xenophon is yellow, and Herodotus is pink. And I really don't know why, but he's really green. So there you are.
I love it. Synesthesia, very, very big right now.
Is it?
Big field of study. It's great. The senses, the archaeology of the senses. There we have it. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to Brown University's Department of Classical Studies and the John Carter Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.